All rise. We will leave. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is now in session. Lord John, the Tribunal Penal International pour ex-Yugoslavie et uit. Please be seated.
Good morning to everyone in and around this courtroom. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Thank you and good morning, Your Honors. This is case number IT 0992T. The prosecutor was Ratko Mladić.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar. Could I have the appearances? Prosecution first.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Alan Teeger, Peter McCloskey, Arthur Traldi, and Adam Weber, with case manager Janet Stewart, appearing for the prosecution.
Thank you, Mr. Tiga. Mr. Lukic, appearances for the defense.
Good morning, Your Honors. Branko Lukic, Miodrag Stojanovic, Dani Vetic, Jason Ellerid, case manager Radovan Đurđević for the defense, and legal assistants Christina Oyang and Laura Bijus and Alessia Eltir. Sorry.
Yes. It's not only know your judges, it's also know your legal team, Mr. Lukic. Thank you for that. We're here today to hear the final arguments of the parties. The Chamber, however, was informed that there was a preliminary matter to be raised by the defense.
Yes, Your Honors. We just wanted to bring to your attention, since the filing hasn't gone through the the electronic webmail system, but we did send a courtesy copy on Friday, and I believe the prosecution has sent a courtesy copy of a response to that filing from Friday. That's our renewed urgent motion for stay of proceedings pending the one appeal, interlocutory appeal that is still pending, and it's based on Your Honors' 21 October 2016 motion, decision on our first motion for stay of proceedings, which said that, quote, no irreversible consequence for the trial or prejudice to the accused would result that could not be remedied by an opportunity to supplement the final brief or...
Mr. Ivitic,
Yeah.
are you reading now, I think it sounds familiar to me, is that what you're reading is the content of your motion?
Actually, I'm reading the content of your order, which is recited in our motion. Yeah.
Yes, yes, that's what I thought. So the motion, we indeed received a courtesy copy. We also received a courtesy copy of the response the prosecution intended to file. We do understand that today at 9:16 the motion was formally filed. The Chamber also received information, Mr. Registrar, I hope you can confirm that meanwhile the prosecution response is officially filed now as well. I can be not as precise as with the 9:16, but it was a couple of minutes ago. That's the Chamber's understanding. So that's where we stand. We have received courtesy copies. We have received information that the motion and the response have been filed. Could the parties confirm, and otherwise I would have to check it now right away, but that the motion as sent to us as a courtesy copy is identical to the one which was filed at 9:16, Mr. Ivitic?
It should be, since I forwarded the same PDF file, so...
Yes, so there was no intention in any way to divert from what you sent us or what you sent to the registry and we then later received as your courtesy copy.
That's correct.
Same question to the prosecution.
Also confirm, Mr. President.
Yes. then under those circumstances, yes, there was a need to verify this because the chamber, having received the courtesy copies and expecting that identical motion and response would be filed, has deliberated on the basis of the courtesy copies, which now turns out to be the motion and the response. Therefore, we can proceed on this matter, and the chamber will now issue its decision on the motion. The motion for the urgent motion, renewed urgent motion, defense motion for the stay of the proceedings is denied, reasons to follow. Which means that we'll now proceed to hear the final argument of the parties. Prosecution first. Mr. Tiga.
Mr. President, Your Honors, in 1993, after his forces had radically altered the demographic picture in the portions of Bosnia claimed by the Bosnian Serbs, Ratko Mladić took credit for what had been done under his command and for the positive situation in which Bosnian Serb negotiators now found themselves. Quote, Mr. President, you have started from the most favorable starting position in Geneva. You had the military result in your hands, unquote. P 2508, pages 32 through 33, and may the court officer be instructed, please, to show the sanctioned presentation on the large screens. That military result, Your Honors, was the realization of a strategy to create a factual situation that could not be reversed. A reconfiguration of Bosnian demographics that the international community, as well as Muslims and Croats, would have to accept as permanent. It didn't happen secretly. As Karadzic quoted a Bosnian Serb war commissioner, quote, "We are skinning the cat alive before the whole world," unquote. P 4584, pages 13 and 15. As the entire world was able to see, what had happened in municipality after municipality was not an unintended effect of the military campaign, but its very purpose. UN Special Rapporteur Mazowiecki reported in August 1992, quote, "Ethnic cleansing does not appear to be the consequence of the war, but rather its goal. This goal, to a large extent, has already been achieved through killings, beatings, rape, destruction of houses, and threats," unquote. It's P 2813, paragraph 6. By the time that the Special Rapporteur made these observations, General Mladić's VRS controlled approximately 70% of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. You can find that at P 4581, pages 38, 48, and 55. By the summer of 1992, they had enough to be thinking about ceasefires and freezing their already advantageous positions. P 3113, pages 1, 3, and 5. Offers of ceasefire, however, did not mean that their territorial objectives had been fully satisfied, as reflected, for example, in General Mladić's November 1992 Directive 4, which orders the VRS to pursue an as-yet unfulfilled strategic objective, number 3, by forcing the enemy, quote, "with the Muslim population," unquote, to leave Birac, Žepa, and Gorazda areas. It's P2217, page 5. Those Eastern Bosnia operations continued, in Karadic's words, quote, packing Muslims in small areas, unquote, P4584, page 13, and culminated, temporarily at any rate, when the international community prevented their takeover of Srebrenica and established safe areas. As General Mladić said, quote, if the international community had not meddled, they, meaning the Muslims, would have paid the price for everything they had done up to then to the Serb people, unquote. P1973, page 5. Despite this setback, the focus on Srebrenica and the remaining enclaves persisted. As General Mladić communicated to the Drina Corps in 1994, which was captured in an information report to the Bratunats Brigade, quote, and this is from the report, quote, we must attain our final goal, an entirely Serbian Podrinja. And that report continued. We must continue to arm, train, discipline, and prepare the RS Army for the execution of this crucial task, the expulsion of Muslims from the Srebrenica enclave, unquote. That's P1505, page 3, also found at transcript 111786 through 90. As General Mladić explained in 1994 to the Bosnian Serb Assembly, the Bosnian Serbs had an historical opportunity to create, quote, not any kind of state, but an all-Serbian state, with as little enemies as possible, those who could be our potential enemies and raise against us in a few years, unquote. His concern, he told the Assembly, was not that Muslims might create a state. His concern, quote, is to have them vanish completely, unquote. P3076, pages 18 through 20. By March 1995, General Mladić and Radovan Karadzic re-intensified their focus on Srebrenica, issuing a directive to create conditions to make the lives of Srebrenica's inhabitants, quote, unbearable. That's Directive 7. By July 2nd, a combat operation in furtherance of Directive 7 was underway. On the 9th of July, General Mladić and Karadzic realized that they could take the enclave itself and change the operation to do so. On the 11th of July, General Mladić walked into Srebrenica and vowed that the time had come to take revenge on the Turks. That's P1147, page 11. Within a short time, over 7,000 Srebrenica men and boys as young as 12, had been systematically murdered, and all of the remaining inhabitants of Srebrenica expelled. The Srebrenica community had been destroyed, had vanished. Meanwhile, Bosnia's capital had been held under what General Mladić called, quote, our hammer, unquote, P431, page 35. Its civilian population subjected to a campaign of shelling and sniping that was increased to place pressure on or retaliate against the Muslim side, or conversely reduced in response to pressures from the international community. Internationals who arrived at different points in the conflict came to the same conclusion, that the primary purpose of the shelling and sniping was to induce terror in the civilian population. The campaign was so pervasive and enduring that life itself in Sarajevo, including even the behavior of children, painfully adapted to it. The effort to produce terror through shelling and sniping was also buttressed by the simultaneous pressure of restrictions on humanitarian aid and basic means of life: water, heating, electricity. These massive criminal efforts, municipalities, Sarajevo, Srebrenica, along with the taking of UN personnel as hostages in May 1995 in order to prevent NATO airstrikes. These efforts are reflected in 4 separate but related JCEs charged in the indictment. All distinct, although each broadly in service of the same goal of achieving a Serbian state on vast territories within Bosnia and Herzegovina with as few historical enemies as possible. Your Honors, by way of presentation, I will be discussing with you aspects of the overarching JCE in the context of addressing claims made in the defense final trial brief. Mr. Traldi will then address General Mladić's implementation of the common purpose, the overarching common purpose. I will then return to speak about count 1, genocide in the municipalities, specifically focusing, as we did in our brief, on the municipality of Prijedor. Mr. Weber will then address the Sarajevo, the terror JCE, followed by Mr. McCloskey on the elimination JCE in Srebrenica in July 1995, the execution of over 7,000 men and boys, and the forcible transfer of the women, children, and elderly. Finally, Your Honors, I will address you on sentencing. More specifically, with respect to my remarks this morning, I will be addressing claims in the defense brief related to the overarching JCE, claims that the common purpose or General Mladić's contributions to it are belied by such things as local autonomy in the municipalities, or no plans by the leadership, or the alleged fact that those who left were welcome to come back, or by General Mladić's alleged lack of control over the VRS, or his benevolent view of non-Serbs. As I will discuss, these claims are false. Indeed, when their basis is more closely examined, the evidence demonstrates the existence of the common purpose and General Mladić's many contributions to it. So I begin with some of the more extraordinary claims in the defense's final brief. Faced with a massive trial record revealing the enormity of his crimes, crimes that he committed by using his authority to control the entire army, the defense attempts to transform General Mladić into a benign but ineffectual officer, determined to protect Muslims against people like Karadzic, but unfortunately only a marginalized secondary figure, less important than the corps commanders. The fundamental principle that a general can delegate authority but not responsibility is turned on its head, as General Mladić now tries to pass off his responsibility for what he once bragged about by blaming his superior and his subordinates in an effort to exculpate himself. The defense claims that command and control principles in the VRS meant that General Mladić could issue general instructions, but was thereafter relegated to an advisory role because, quote, exclusive, unquote, command was assumed by the Corps commanders, whom they want you to believe were the most powerful and important people in the VRS. That's paragraphs 643 through 644 of the defense brief.
Could I just check with you, Mr. The transcript, at least the draft, reads conclusive. Did I hear you say exclusive?
Yes, Your Honor, exclusive, thank you.
Thank you.
Thus, according to the defense, Dragomir Milosevic and Mladić were the ones who really controlled the army in Sarajevo. In Srebrenica, although the accused was physically present, command lay in the hands of Krstić, para 644 of the defense brief. That claim distorts the operative language by taking it out of context. For example, the defense pretends that the term exclusive command in reference to a corps commander means that no one else can tell him what to do. In fact, the term means that within the Corps, it is the commander who is at the top and no one else. At the same time, however, military doctrine and VRS regulations covering Corps commanders recognize the existence of superior command. Indeed, the defense's conception of command would render the very concept of chain of command, with which we have all become familiar during the course of this case, meaningless. It is not only facially preposterous, but it is belied by the extensive evidence you have heard from VRS and international witnesses that the chain of command was the operative principle. And in that chain, General Mladić fully carried out, his role as commander, issuing and overseeing the implementation of his orders to the Corps commanders on a continuing basis. As General Milovanovic explained to you, the Corps commanders would send the main staff in their daily reports their decisions and plans for the following day's activities, which General Mladić would then approve or reject. That's T 1696 through 97. But let's watch just half a minute from the war. 30 seconds, which embody what the evidence has repeatedly shown about General Mladić's commanding role, and which reflects the very absurdity of casting him as a secondary and marginal figure, as a mere advisor. Your Honors, this is the third Hotel Fontana meeting. The Chamber will recall General Mladić's domineering presence in each of the three meetings, although one could be excused for forgetting the presence of other officers in the face of that dominance. Here, with Krstić sitting quietly by his side, this clip is a reminder of who was in charge, of who called the shots.
Želim da vam pomognem, ali tražim apsolutnu saradnju civilnog stanovništva jer je vaša vojska poražena. Nema potrebe da ginu ni vaš muž, ni vaša braća, ni vaše komšije. Dovoljno je da kažete šta želite. I sinoć sam rekao, gospodine, možete opstati ili nestati.
It is General Mladić who makes clear what will happen to, quote, your husbands, your brothers, your neighbors. This is just 30 seconds from a particular event, Your Honors, but it captures what has been proven over and over in intercepts, in written orders, in testimony about General Mladić's commanding presence and commanding role over the Army. As you will hear in more detail from subsequent presentations, witnesses from virtually every level of command made clear that in the VRS you follow orders that come from the top and that move down the chain of command, and that General Mladić was the superior commander over each of the corps commanders. And you could find that in the prosecution final brief at paragraphs 94 through 109, 121 through 152, 253 through 271, 714 through 759. One of those witnesses put this reality in simple, concrete terms. When asked about the principles of unity of command and singleness of command, he said, quote, "There's a pyramid. On the top of this pyramid is a supreme commander, the chief of general staff, and then it goes all the way down to the level of corporal and private. Everyone has their own superior, and the superior has the right to issue orders and to supervise the implementation of those orders, and those who are subordinates are in charge of carrying out those orders," unquote. That's found at T5018.
Do you have the name of the person being quoted?
That's confidential, Mr. President, so I quote it just by
Thank you.
the reference. As Král said, quote, "The Army of Republika Srpska operates on the principle of subordination, and orders of superior officers, especially General Mladić, his orders were strictly adhered to and carried out," unquote. That's T27436. And as Milovanović testified, General Mladić, as commander of the main staff, had the right to issue orders to anyone in the VRS. That's T16923. Now, not content with claiming that it is his subordinate officers who are responsible, not him, General Mladić also claims that he was marginalized by Radovan Karadzic, with whom Mladić allegedly disagreed on how to treat Muslims. Now, let's set aside for the moment such evidence as the fact that, as Karadzic put it, he and Mladić, quote, "talked about things as brothers," unquote, and their aim was, quote, was to, quote, "move together towards the same goal," unquote. Set aside the fact that although Milovanović heard talk of a conflict between Mladić and Karadzic, quote, "especially after the war," unquote, during the course of the war, he, quote, "never," unquote, saw them quarrel. That's T17107. But apart from these matters, according to the defense, the, quote, "best illustration," unquote, of Mladić's claim is Directive 7. The defense asserts that Karadzic bypassed General Mladić by sending Directive 7 directly on to the corps, and that when General Mladić found out, he issued a superseding directive, Directive 7.1, that omitted the illegal order to create, quote, "an unbearable situation of total insecurity," unquote, to force Muslim civilians out. That's found at paragraphs 571 through 72 of the defense brief. Directive 7 and 7.1 together, the defense claims, quote, "shows the disparity," unquote, between the criminally minded Karadzic, who wanted to illegally put pressure on the civilian population, and General Mladić, who, quote, "took it upon himself, unquote, not to do that. That's at paragraphs 572 through 573. Now that is an epic story of moral bravery. And it is as false as it is dramatic. It rests on General Milovanovich's testimony that A, Karadzic improperly sent Directive 7 directly to the Corps. That's T16993 and 995. And that General Mladić omitted the illegal order from his directive to protect the civilian population. That's at transcript 16996. What the evidence actually reveals, however, what General Milovanović was forced to admit when confronted with documents, is that Milovanović forwarded Directive 7 to all the Corps. Not just to the 1KK, which he initially was forced to admit, but also to the Drina Corps, the Sarajevo-Romania Corps, the Herzegovina Corps, all of which also belie General Milovanović's preposterous claim that he saw the directive for the first time long after the war. That's at transcript 16996 through 99. As for the claim that the omission of the illegal order to make life unbearable reflected General Mladić's effort to protect civilians, that was exposed as false when Milovanović admitted that details were omitted from 7.1 because they were, quote, already contained in Directive 7, unquote, and that in fact, Directive 7 remained operative. That's transcript 17126 through 27. And that is further confirmed by the fact that in Directive 7.1 itself, General Mladić twice references Directive 7 as authority. Quote, on the basis of Directive number 7, or, quote, in accordance with Directive number 7, unquote. That's P 1470, page 2 and page 4. Beyond that, Directive 7 bears General Mladić's mark, echoing his intentions and indeed his words. As mentioned, Mladić's July 1994 meeting at the Corps Command was reflected in a Bratinats Brigade information report, which said, quote, the enemy's life has to be made unbearable and their temporary stay in the enclave impossible, so that they leave the enclave en masse as soon as possible, realizing that they cannot survive there, unquote. That's P 1505, page 3. Unbearable. And on 8 March 1995, the day Karadzic signed Directive 7, General Mladić held a meeting at the main staff, which was reflected in General Zhivanovich's notebooks as, quote, make life impossible, unquote. That's P 5274, page 27. And you can find a detailed discussion at the prosecution brief at paragraphs 426 through 452. This is just one of many examples, Your Honors, a portion of which you'll hear about over the next few days, of claims made in the defense brief that crumble upon scrutiny. In contrast to the depiction of Karadzic, Mladić is cast as a beneficent protector of Muslims. Now, that is grounded on scattered examples, none of which supports the proposition, such as the alleged protection of Muslim villages, at paragraphs 685 through 690 of the defense brief, the protection of Bosnian Croat civilians, 696 through 699, or that he issued orders or made pronouncements to protect civilians and obey international humanitarian law. For example, paragraph 795 through 796, paragraph 414 of the defense final brief. These references, however, do not support these assertions, which in any event, Your Honors, are belied by the vast volume of evidence demonstrating General Mladić's commitment to the contrary. For example, Mladić's alleged protection of Bosnian Croat civilians is addressed at paragraph 459 of our brief, and that outlines the evidence demonstrating that this transfer was not altruistic, but arranged in order to advance Bosnia's division, to obtain military advantage for the Bosnian Serbs, for public relations purposes, and indeed for money. Similarly, the claim that the main staff protected non-Serb villages relies on the testimony of General Sokanović, that life in Muslim Podjeplia, near the main staff, continued unhindered. That claim is belied by the evidence that Podjeplia was burned to the ground in August 1992, following threats by Salapura to set on fire all Muslim villages in the area up to the Drina. That's at P3306, paragraphs 7 through 8, and also found at the prosecution final brief at paragraph 305. As for orders to protect civilians and the alleged protection of Muslim villages, Muslim and Croat villages, you will hear in subsequent presentations about the superficially cosmetic nature of General Mladić's toothless orders to obey international humanitarian law, and also about the cover-ups, systemic failures to prosecute, promotions and praise for perpetrators of those crimes, which more accurately reflected General Mladić's position on crimes against Muslims and Croats, which fell within the common purpose. For that, see prosecution final brief, paragraphs 490 through 91. And you'll also hear, Your Honors, about how non-Serbs were treated in the municipalities, in Sarajevo, and in Srebrenica. And I will address you a bit later on the claim related to paragraph 414 of the defense final brief and the 16th session. More generally, the broad claim that General Mladić was a benefactor and protector of Muslims and Croats, whose only ethnic distinctions were made for benevolent purposes, simply cannot withstand the totality of the evidence. One candid moment caught on video of General Mladić on a short trip with a Serbian-Canadian supporter of the RS encapsulates what we have all learned and what the evidence shows about General Mladić's view of Muslims. Now that clip begins, you may recall, Your Honors, shortly after General Mladić has just explained that whenever I come by Sarajevo, I kill someone in passing. I go kick the hell out of the Turks. Who gives a fuck for them? And now let's watch a short clip from the rest of that video.
Evo vidi, sve su ovo Turci bili zaprečeni. Vidi put za njihovo selo Gođe. Ovdje je selo Pane bilo tursko. Sad ćemo prema njemu. Ovo ti snimi slobodno neka vide naši Srbi šta smo ih radili, kako su Turke sredili. U Podrinju smo mi Turke pomlatili. Da ih ne čuvaju Amerikanci i Englezi, Ukrajinci i Kanađani u Srebrenici. Holanđani, davno bi njih nestalo na ovom prostoru. Evo, gledaj, vidiš kako im je selo bilo, pravo. Da ti malo usporim da ih stignem. Ja. Ti vidi kako Turčin kuću ima i evo moju. Turska kuća. Ovo. To je bila turska kuća. I ona tamo je bila turska. I ona sve. Evo. Vidiš kako su finu pitomu zemlju Turci imali.
Look what a house this Turkish motherfucker had. Showing off destroyed Muslim villages, Mladić exhibits pride and deep satisfaction at what he and his forces had achieved, and nothing but contempt for the victims. These attitudes were also reflected in Mladić's conversation with Van Down, during which he crudely mimicked Muslims and told Van Down that the presence of a Nigerian in Van Down's unit was an indication that Mladić would be obliged to come to Holland in 10 years to protect the Dutch from other races and from Muslims. You can find that at the prosecution final brief, paragraph 1201. The brazenly false attempt to depict himself as a Muslim benefactor and to blame his superior and his subordinates merely exposes General Mladić's awareness of the criminal nature of the plan to which he once boasted about contributing. That plan, which was formed before General Mladić was recruited to join, had its roots in events that took place before he returned to his birth republic in 1992. And that background will take us to some of the other defense claims about the common purpose. In 1990, national elections were held in Bosnia in the wake of communism's declining hold on power. The three nationalist parties were overwhelming winners, essentially corresponding to their demographic ratio in Bosnia. Elated by the fall of communism and what they saw as the reawakening of Serbian consciousness, Bosnian Serb leaders nevertheless were concerned about the increasing risk of Yugoslavia's dissolution and the prospect that Bosnia would become a sovereign and independent nation. Even before the election, the SDS leadership expressed its categorical opposition to the possibility of Bosnia becoming sovereign and independent. As Karadzic said in an interview in July 1990, quote, "The Serbs will not allow to live in some new NDH, nor in some state which is without their matrix, Serbia." That's P7759, page 6. In the summer and fall of 1991, the SDS strongly supported JNA efforts in response to Croatia's independence, and meanwhile attempted unsuccessfully to reach a negotiated solution with Muslims and Croats that would keep Bosnia in Yugoslavia, such as the Belgrade Initiative or the so-called Historic Agreement. In the face of the unsuccessful negotiations, however, by September 1991, the SDS had established several Serbian autonomous regions, the purpose of which was to, quote, destroy, unquote, the unitary Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's P7000, page 4 and page 6. When the Bosnian Muslims and Croats approved a memorandum of independence at the controversial 8th session of the Joint Parliament on the 14th and 15th of October 1991, the Bosnian Serb leadership, in Karadic's words to Milosevic, decided to, quote, move on, unquote. As detailed in paragraphs 175 through 190 of the prosecution brief, they established parallel institutions aimed at the creation of a Bosnian Serb state and organized the means to do so by force if necessary. At the republic level, a parallel Bosnian Serb assembly and a shadow government, the Council of Ministers, were established. At the municipal level, Karadzic issued instructions, the variant A and B instructions, for the creation of Bosnian Serb crisis staffs that would spearhead the eventual takeover of the claimed areas. Karadzic began to emphasize during this period, as he would continue to do throughout the conflict, that Muslims and Croats were historical enemies whose inherent incompatibility with Serbs precluded coexistence. Find that at paragraphs 161 through 163 of the prosecution brief. Muslims and Serbs, he claimed, were like a dog and a cat, or plants that cannot grow side by side. See the prosecution final brief, footnote 603. Karadzic stressed the alleged demographic threat resulting from the Muslim birth rate, his words casting them as an unstoppable demographic threat. Quote, "They'll overwhelm you with their birth rate and tricks," unquote. That's P3900, page 36. Thus, even a minority of Muslims were a threat, much less the majority communities in eastern or northwest Bosnia, ultimately claimed by the Bosnian Serbs. As Karadzic would tell the assembly, explaining why smaller but ethnically pure territories were preferable to controlling all of Bosnia, with Muslims, the, quote, 23% would rise to 24% the day after, and the day after that one, it would be 25%, because that is how it is with them, unquote. P3076, page 23 and 25. At the same time, however, the Bosnian Serb leadership claimed vast territories where Serbs and non-Serbs were intermingled. Indeed, where non-Serbs were the majority. Now, they attempted to justify these claims in various ways. For example, that Serbs were entitled to territory where they had been a majority before World War II. Or that the plebiscite meant entitlement to any territory where a majority of Serbs, no matter how small a percentage of the actual population, had voted to stay in Yugoslavia. Or justified simply on the basis that the area was deemed strategically significant to the Bosnian Serbs. You'll find that at paragraphs 1644 through 66. As Karadzic reminisced in 1995, quote, "To tell the truth, there are towns that we've grabbed for ourselves, and there were only 30% of us. I can name as many of those as you want, but we cannot give up the towns where we made up 70%. Don't let this get around, but remember how many of us there were in Bratunac, how many in Srebrenica, how many in Visegrad, how many in Rogatica, how many in Vlasenica, in Zvornik, etc. Due to strategic importance, they had to become ours, and no one is practically questioning it anymore," unquote. That's P4584, pages 17 through 18. As one witness observed, these undesired people on desired territory weren't going to disappear by magic. And separating them, quote, "is what ethnic cleansing was designed to do," unquote. That's P3103, transcript 4205. By late March 1992, as Bosnian independence loomed, Karadzic advised his officials that they could be confident that the number of Bosnian Serb police was sufficient, and that soon the Bosnian Serbs would, quote, literally assume control of the entire territory, unquote, of their municipalities, citing Zvornik as one example. That's P406, page 22. The takeover of Bijeljina a week later signaled the commencement of that process, sometimes accompanied by attacks on non-Serb villages and forcible removal of non-Serbs, sometimes by more slowly escalating forms of persecution. Serb authorities, including Slobodan Milosevic, helped implement the beginnings of the ethnic cleansing campaign through the JNA and the, quote, strong support, unquote, the Bosnian Serbs had received from the DB, from State Security. That's P353, page 133. This included the deployment of Arkon's men to Bijeljina and Zvornik. As Bell reported contemporaneously, Serb forces, including Arkon's men, were, quote, redrawing, unquote, the ethnic map of Bosnia. That's P1874 and P832, page 24. Thus, by the time that General Mladić assumed command of the newly formed Army of Republika Srpska, the process of removing Muslims and Croats through a variety of crimes was underway, as he was duly informed. That's paragraphs 200 through 203. Indeed, by 12 May, when he was formally appointed Chief of the Main Staff, the nature of the cleansing campaign was obvious to the world. As the UN Secretary General reported that day, quote, all international observers agree that what is happening is a concerted effort by the Serbs of Bosnia and Herzegovina with the acquiescence of, and at least some support from, the JNA to create ethnically pure regions. The techniques used are the seizure of territory by military force and intimidation of the non-Serb population. That's P2814, paragraph 5. And when we return from our break, Your Honors, I'd like to pick up on some of the defense claims in respect of this evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Tiga. We'll take a break. We resume at 10 minutes to 11 o'clock.
All rise. Huye Bouleve.